This is Real Talk, the Customer Insights Show with Jen Vogel, a top-rated live stream and podcast in the market research and insights industry. We stream live on LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube, and you can listen on all major podcast channels. Join Jen and her guests for a weekly discussion around topics that will help you understand your customers better. Real Talk is presented to you by VoxPopMe, the leader in video research and ranked number 1 in qualitative research by Grit 2 years running. Here's today's conversation.
Hello, insights professionals, marketers, and everyone who wants to understand their customers better. I'm your host, Jen Vogel. Today, we are joined by John Geraci, president at Crux Research and author of POLL-ARIZED, Why Americans Don't Trust the Polls and How to Fix Them Before It's Too Late. I'm very excited to talk about this polarizing topic. Welcome to the show, John.
Yeah, thank you. Nice to meet you, John. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this conversation. I know it's a hot topic, and I'm curious to understand what sparked you to write this book.
Yeah, it's really kind of strange because I'm not really an author, and it's kind of an accidental book in a way. After the 2020 election, I had sort of a sleepless night. I was watching the news coverage of the polls, and the pollsters were really kind of taking a beating. We didn't really even know what the result of the election was going to be like. But the one thing we kind of could unite on as a country is that the pollsters weren't doing a very good job. Just listening to the news coverage, it was sort of like the election had become this referendum on the polls as much as a way to elect our next president. They were just getting really beat up, and it was really kind of troubling me. And one of the reasons, there was really 2 reasons why. And one was the night before the election, I put up a blog posting on our corporate blog stating all the reasons why I thought the pollsters were going to get it right in 2020. And within 24 hours, I realized that was not going to age very well. And as it turns out, the polling error in 2020 was about double what it was in 2016. So I had a lot of egg on my face there. So I felt really bad about that. And then the next day I had a client call me, and she called me with a question that I think every client should ask their suppliers. And I was in fear of this question that she asked me. She said, John, I do a lot of research with you. And the research I do with you is infinitely more complex than an election poll. So why should I trust my research projects with you when you guys can't even predict the election right? And I didn't have a very good answer for that. And it really troubled me. And that was really the genesis of the book, because I realized I need to find an answer for that and get comfortable with that myself. So I started reading all these things about the polls. And one of the very first things I found was there's a lot written on the polls. Like everything in the media today, there's a lot of disinformation out there. It was really hard to figure out what was right and what was wrong. But there was really not my perspective, a perspective of somebody who has actually done polls and opinion research projects. All the critiques of the polls seem to be done by the media or academics, people that have never actually done a poll. So I thought an insider perspective might be very interesting to people, because a lot of people don't really understand the complexity of how they actually do get done. And this turned into being, I would call it like the mother of all rabbit holes for me. I'm a research guy. I was able to get a hold of the polls from 2000 to 2020, 6 cycles of polls, load them in SPSS, and I just started geeking out myself because I wanted to get back to this client with a good answer to that question. Why should I trust my studies with you when you can't do something as simple as an election poll? And this book is a result of that really sort of major wormhole that I went down, and I couldn't kind of lose sight of it. There was this point where I had all my notes taken. I looked at it and said, this really could become a book if I interview some pollsters, if I do my own poll, if I kind of connect it together in a story of why do we care about the polls, how good or bad are they, what's going wrong with them, what do we need to do to fix them. I thought it was kind of a compelling book, and so that was it. And it's done really well. It's actually a bestseller and I think it's mainly a bestseller because it's got classified as a political book. It's in campaigns and elections. But I want anyone listening to this to know, I wrote this very much with insights professionals in mind. I didn't really write it for a popular audience. It was written for insights professionals, but it's sort of found surprisingly a popular audience. So big wormhole I went down. I just couldn't leave it alone. It was really bothering me. And I wanted to get a good answer to that question. That's really why I wrote the book.
Yeah. And I mean, isn't it the case with really anything that the biggest criticism comes from people who have never done it? Well, you could apply that that to really anything, right? Like everybody's telling everybody else how to do their jobs. And this is a great example of that. So I could totally see where you found that white space. I'm curious, like what you mentioned, that blog post you wrote that did not age very well. Like what was it about the election that you felt like the pollsters were going to get it right, and what changed?
Yeah, I thought 2016 was a nightmare year for the pollsters, right? We hadn't had a year like that since 1948. Everyone will remember Dewey defeats Truman, right?
Wow.
Didn't go too well for the pollsters. And the one thing I think everyone should be in fear of is, in my opinion, that miscue by pollsters set back market research and insights for a generation. Pollsters didn't really recover from that, I would say, until about the mid 70s, early 80s. And there were other things going on. I mean, random digit telephone techniques really came of age sort of in the 70s and 80s. And, we had to kind of wait for that till we could do those things really well. But I really worry, and I still worry, that what happened in 2016 is going to set us back another generation. But yeah, I think, what happened is the industry was very responsible after 2016. They got together and they kind of tried to figure out what went wrong. And they had some real definitive things that went wrong. I mean, the most glaring was they didn't sample lower education people enough. So they didn't, even account for education in their quotas and their weighting schemes. And so they decided to do that again. I thought it would work, but it didn't. And there's reasons why it didn't, which we can get into in a little bit. So yeah, I looked at, I looked back at that blog post this morning, and I did say some reasons why I thought they might get it wrong, but on that, I really would have put my money on it, and I was wrong. And now, it's always a benefit of hindsight. I can kind of see why at this point.
Oh yeah, hindsight, right?
Yeah, everyone can. That's part of the way the pollsters react, though. I'll let you know a little bit of what they do, right? They when like an election poll goes wrong, the methodologists will get together and kind of figure out why. Right. And what they will do is basically model to the back data. So they'll look and say, gee, if we had just kind of weighted this group up or this group down, we would have had this perfect prediction for 2016. And you can kind of always do that it's a big data set. Afterwards, you can kind of always create some model that would have perfectly predicted the 2016 election. Right. So what they then do is then take that forward and assume that model will work for 2020. And I'll say I've given a few book talks now. The most common question I get in book talks is, well, are they going to get it right in 2024? And I've learned my lesson here, right? I've learned my lesson, not say yes or no, but the short answer is they will get it right in 2024 to the extent that 2024 looks like 2020, to the extent the world doesn't change. And I would never bet on that anymore. That the world won't change. So they basically applied a model that would have worked really well in 2016 to 2020, when there was really no reason to think that 2020 would be similar. I mean, we had a pandemic going on. The way people voted was different. Turnout was way higher. There were a lot of differences that I didn't see in advance. But again, it would probably get into my background a little bit. I'm more of a survey researcher than a pollster, so wasn't paying that close attention to it.
Sure. You are now.
Yeah, I am now. Yeah.
That's so interesting. That makes a lot of sense. Like modeling it on, what it looked like the 4 years prior could work, might not work, but it's not the surefire way. And you mentioned, let's take a step back. I'd love to understand kind of your background and how you came up in the insights industry and what your focus was kind of prior to getting involved in this polling.
Yeah, I probably should have started with that. I've been in this field a long time. I started in 1989, and I've been doing really custom survey research ever since. I started at a small company that morphed to become Harris Interactive, which is really one of the best known polling firms in the world, best known for the Harris poll. The company I started with had about 30 employees. When I ended up leaving that company, they had 900. So I saw a lot of growth and a lot of change, and a lot of that was centered on around the turn of the century. Harris Interactive was really known as the market pioneer in online polling. We were the ones leading the charge. We were the first ones doing online polling for elections. And like, for example, in the year 2000, we had 72 election predictions that we made, and we got 71 of 72 correct online at a time when only like a third of the population was online. So it was, much was a real challenge at that time. And so, that's a big part of my formative experience. But about 2006, early in 2006, I left the Harris Poll and started my own company. So my company is called Crux Research, and we're a small agency. We do opinion polls. We don't do election polls. We predominantly do complex survey research projects for corporations and nonprofits. Our through line is we're sort of youth experts. So in short, we say if you're an organization that does survey research that is doing something to make the world better for young people, you're probably in our client list or someone we want to work with. So that's kind of our niche within that. So I'm a survey researcher. I've been doing it a long time. I think one of the neat things is you get a little geeky when you're a researcher. But I've got a list of every project I've ever done, and there's more than 3,000 of them at this point. So I've made all the mistakes, and that's part I highlight a lot of them in the book as well. So a really long time survey researcher, mostly custom research, written a lot of questionnaires in my day, and fielded a lot of projects.
I love that you have a list of all the projects that you've done.
Yeah.
That's so awesome.
Yeah, I started when I first started. Then it just kind of kept going wherever I worked. I just kept it. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. It's like such an artifact to have now, right? Like you don't think much of it in the beginning, but that's fantastic.
Yeah, I don't even remember a lot of them when I look back on it, by the way. I don't even remember the stuff.
Oh, you don't? That was going to be what I was going to ask. Do you remember actually running them or the results or what you did with them? But after 3,000, I would imagine only some stick around in your mind. We're gonna have to after we're done with this show, we're gonna have to play the name game from all the Harris people that I worked with a lot of former Harris people, very smart people, but really interesting background. And it makes sense, that you have this kind of interest and focus on the polls based on that. Getting back into that, how good or bad are the polls really?
Yeah, good question. I've learned to answer this in a different way because this, of course, it's part of the book. Are the polls? I gathered all these polls. I looked at it and I was trying to kind of come up. And I know the first few times I answered this, I'll probably give you the long answer as well. I think I confused everybody, but I'll give you a very, very short answer of it. How good or bad are the polls? The short answer that I think everybody can agree with is they're not good enough. I think everyone can agree with that. How good or bad they are depends a lot on your perspective, who you are, and what criteria you want to use to judge them by. So I'll give you an example. The pollsters more like the academics studying the polls, will look at something that looks at sort of the error rate of the poll, something called the absolute error of the poll, right? And if we look at that from 2000, I think it's 75% of the polls I studied are lower than the historical error rate of polls, right? So I think it's absolutely fair to say, there's an absolute fair thing to say is that the polls are really, they're not any worse than they ever have been. And you could make the case that they're actually getting better, right? So from that perspective, you say, hey, the polls are great, right? Another perspective is you could look at the margin of error, the sampling error. Are you within your sampling error? And pollsters like to say that a lot, but that doesn't hold a lot of water. I wrote down the stat because I want to make sure I said it right. Of all the polls I studied, this is all the final election polls from year 2000 onward. 56% of them were in their sampling error, right? So 56% within your sampling error, you don't have to go very far in a statistics class to know that number is supposed to be 95%. Because that's literally what a sampling error means, that you're going to get it right 95% of the time within the error. So there's something going on there. So from the pollster perspective, well, some of us are getting it right, some of us aren't. But what really matters is the popular perspective. It's sort of like what really matters at the end of the day when you do a survey research project is how your clients viewed it, right? Well, the clients of these polls are elected officials, they are the media, and then they're everybody, right? The public, right? And the bottom line is they think we're failing miserably. The poll I did for the book suggested only 17% of the American population currently trust pollsters. And that's down from 45% just 6 years ago. So, we're just on top of used car salesmen and Congress. We're just better than them, right? So it's tough. It's really, it's a tough thing. So so how good or bad are the polls? I look at it and say, given the challenges that pollsters are facing these days, they're doing a great job. We expect those methodologists to be miracle workers. In some sense, they are, but they're really not focusing on the right issues to preserve this going forward. And I'm sure we'll talk about that. What we need to do going forward. They're miracle workers. By the analogy I've been using, it's sort of like we're expecting them to make steak and we're giving them hamburger in terms of their input. They're like chefs. And, if you give hamburger to Bobby Flay, he's not gonna be able to make a steak out of it. He's probably gonna make a pretty good hamburger out of it, right? They're really fighting the data that we're giving them to work with to begin with. So, how good or bad are the polls? Not good enough is the answer. And they're not going to get better if we don't focus on what really matters. And currently, I don't believe that we are.
So one thing that I'm curious about, this stat that you mentioned of like 17% of the population trusts the pollsters. I would love to do some sort of like what people do and what people say comparison, because like the general sense I get is we all sit around and say you can't trust the polls, and yet we're so bummed when they're wrong, we're so disappointed when, we weren't we didn't think that was going to happen because the poll said something else, but we say we don't trust them. I wonder if it's like a, purposeful forgetting, right? Like the day after the election, nobody trusts the polls, but 3.5 years later, we're all over them. What's that?
We hate them, but we're addicted to them. And one of the things I'd like to really put forward, I try to make this as a theme throughout the book, is it doesn't serve anyone well to bash the polls. The polls are very important. Now, the one thing that I really gained that, you get a 30-year career, you're head down in projects all the time. You never step back sometimes to kind of think of what you're doing for a living. I'm getting a little later in career, so I can kind of mention this is, I sort of gained this appreciation for how important our jobs are in the insights industry. Because, in the polling world, opinion polls are really how we keep our elected officials honest in a democracy, in a representative democracy like we have. Without them, there's a Thomas Jefferson quote. I'll butcher this a little bit, but he says something like, where the law of the law of the many gets ignored, the law of the loudest starts getting heard. It's something like that. So, when we ignore public opinion, we're really allowing this vacuum to happen, and we're seeing it where sort of the loudest voices have sway. And the loudest voices are extreme voices, people with money, people with microphones. It's not the rest of us. It's not sort of the moderate middle that gets listened to. But back to the insights industry, I sort of gained this appreciation. You see, we're pretty introverted people on the whole, insights professionals, and we're also a support function. So we're not really out there. We support a marketing department. If you're a supplier, I support all sorts of clients. We're never really at the forefront. We're sort of in the background a lot, but we're sort of an essential piece of how the capitalist system works. We keep businesses from getting really inefficient by keeping them in touch with their customers. So I really gained this great appreciation for what we do for a living along the way here. So we got to get better. Now, it doesn't do anyone. I mean, it's not that I don't criticize the polls, but I think I do it in a very constructive way, because they're not doing a good enough job. But we need to turn the conversation. So we're talking about how to help them do a better job.
Yeah. And you mentioned, you think actually, given the challenges that they face, they're doing a pretty good job. Like, what are some of those challenges that the pollsters are faced with?
Yeah, a central tenet of the book is if you look at critiques of the polls, you'll almost, and even what the industry themselves, the APOR reports do, and the academics studying it, they almost always center on one type of error, which is sampling error, right? That almost everything they do. And I start the book with a quote from Humphrey Taylor. And Humphrey Taylor was the longtime chairman of the Harris Poll. Very fortunate I've worked with him in my career. And the quote, I'm going to miss it a little bit. I'll try to paraphrase it, but it says something like this. This is how my book starts. It says, whenever someone in the media asks me what the potential margin for error is on a poll, I can only answer them in one honest way. The potential margin for error is infinite. right? And this is the guy who I would say is who's saying this is someone that I think should be on the Mount Rushmore of polling. Very well respected person. Potential for error is infinite. So we only study one, which is sampling error. And the one we're missing, there's a huge elephant in the room. And that's really the poor response rates we get on our surveys. To fast forward as far as I can in the book, the last thing I say in the book is this, is imagine a world, for a second, just imagine a world where absolutely everybody you attempted to contact for a survey agreed to take part and answered honestly. Do you think we'd have any of these problems? No, right? So response rates, that is the issue we've got to work on. I mean, more literally, it's the non-response bias that we get. And let me just tell you a really quick story. I started in this industry in 1989. And our estimates in 1989 were that with a random digit telephone study, we felt that about 90% of the population was covered by random digit dialing and also were willing to take part in the polls. So about 90% of the population was willing to take part in our polls. And I can tell you in the studies I did, I routinely got response rates between 70 and 80%. So we're getting 90% will take part, between 70 and 80% will respond. If you go till today, the latest estimates I've seen is that about 10% of the US population is willing to take part in a poll. And the net response rates we get, whether you're on the phone or online, is somewhere between 2 and 4%. It depends on how you do your data cleaning and what source you look at. So we've gone from covering 90% of the population with a 70% response rate to surveying the same 10% of the people over and over and again with a 2, 3, 4% response rate. And on the whole, I feel like the industry is just ignoring that issue, and we're literally not going to be around for long if we continue to. So that's the research through line of the whole book. We've got to talk more about response rates and non-response bias. It's everything.
That is a massive difference from 1989 till now, the willingness to participate. And, you mentioned how important public opinion is. This is no longer public opinion if we're only surveying 2% of the population, right? So it's like we're not even serving the purpose of the polls by getting the middle voices heard. It's only the ones willing to participate. So, I mean, that seems like a massive undertaking. And I mean, you mentioned too, like phone and online. Is that the typical methodology that's used for polling?
Yeah, it's interesting that the one of the things that happens in the polling industry is their pollsters are slower to adapt than market researchers are, other insights professionals. And I chalk that up to pollsters tend to be academic people and tend to be more sort of old line companies. I always say their next best job would be to work in academia, which is a great thing. It means one, they're brilliant, but it means number two, they're slow, right, in what they do compared to us. And that was really, really evident when we were transitioning to online research. We were at Harris Interactive, we were promoting it really strongly. The rest of the old line industry was really slow to adapt. And even today, election polling is the only area of survey research I can think of that actually still uses telephone polls. I was trying to think of a use case where I would ever suggest a telephone poll to a client in a consumer setting, not business to business. When would I'm hard pressed even to think of when I would do it, because the response bias is just as bad, and it literally costs about 10 times as much and takes about 3 times as long. There probably are some use cases, but on the whole, market researchers aren't doing telephone polls anymore. And part, here's a little insider thing. I'll give you this kind of a clue just to let you know if you're interested in the book, right? Is I try to get angles on things that I think nobody else would think of. And it's things like this. In the old days when we were doing telephone polls, we had a telephone survey center in the back of our building, literally attached to our building. So it was really tightly managed. We had a lot of polls going through it. I personally would brief the interviewers, get on the phone myself, really well connected, not just with the supervisors, the project staff, really, really well done, right? Today, there are so few telephone polls being done, almost nobody runs their own telephone center. So the control over the interviewers, the monitoring of it isn't anywhere near what it once was. You're using a phone center that most likely isn't even in this country, that you don't have anywhere near the amount of control over, and the quality control, it just isn't there. So that's like an example that I could try to give, like these little insider things that have happened that would affect the the effectiveness of the predictive power of a telephone election poll going forward. And it's the kind of thing you'll never see written anywhere else, So, I try to do a lot of things like that in the book.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point that I would never even think of. But also, I would never think to, like you said, run a telephone poll for anything at this point. But I mean, is that the path to fixing the polling problem that we have now? Is it methodology? Is it something else? Like how do we fix it?
Yeah, it's hard. I see, it's interesting. You look at our industry, like I said, we tend to be pretty slow. And a lot has happened in the last 5-6 years. And I know your organization is very involved in this. And I want to make sure I say this very respectfully. There's been a lot of investment in the research insights industry in the last 5-6 years. And if you really step back as a business case, you can see why. The demand for insights has never been higher. Organizations are doing more studies, more research studies, more surveys than they have ever done. There's no doubt about it, right? But at the same time, you got a field that traditionally has been really slow to adapt to new technologies. So that's a prescription for venture capital, and private equity firms to come in and want to invest in technology. And so what I've seen being done is I always view projects as sort of like a U with profitability. The most profitable part of projects tend to be at the beginning and end. So everything that happens to the point where the questionnaire has been drafted is really profitable. And everything that happens once you have the data out of the field is really profitable. But that piece in the middle, for the most part, is not profitable to a research company. And that is where a lot of the time and money is being spent. And so what I'm seeing with this influx in investment is it's kind of all going towards that middle. And there's always a saying in project management that you need to do things fast, and you need to do them good, and you need to do them cheap, right? And it seems to me the investment is really being very successful at making them fast and making them cheap. We're doing things way faster than we did in 1989. We're doing things way less expensively, which is causing us to do even more things. I am not seeing a lot of that investment going towards making what we do better in terms of the samples we produce. And that's ultimately going to hurt us. And I think there's you call it like a tragedy of the commons problem with, like, for instance, panels that we use. Right, we're all using the same panels. I think people outside the industry don't get that. People that don't work in polling don't realize all the pollsters doing the election polls, they're all using the same panels. They're all mainly using the same 2 or 3 panels, right? Yeah. Because there's dominant players and they're surveying the same people over and over again without a lot of coordination. And what's happening is, like, for my next study, the best thing for me to do on that study is to squeeze as much good information out of that respondent I can. Whether it takes me 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes. That's the best thing for me to do. But then, tomorrow you're coming there and serving them with your study, and I've made them a little bit more less responsive. And you do the same thing. And it kind of over and over, there's no coordination in the industry. And we've gotten to a point. I'll tell you, the other thing that happens to me in book talks is people come up to me afterwards and say, I am so sick of how many surveys I get. I can't go to the doctor. I can't go to the car dealer without getting peppered with surveys after. People are sick of that. And I go back to really when I first started. There's this company called the Gordon Black Corporation that morphed to be Harris Interactive, and we were very sort of famous locally and building this national reputation because we were the pollster for USA Today. But we were kind of growing really well known in the area that I worked in, right? And when I first started, if I went to a cocktail party, people would come up to me and ask me one of 2 things when they learned where I worked. They would say, oh my God, I took a poll from you recently and it was a lot of fun. Yeah, they describe the poll, say, were you behind that one? This is really fun. And the other thing they would be really mad that we had never called them for a poll. They'd be really, and I know I read a lot of George Gallup stuff. Gallup said he got that question all the time. Like, how come you never call me? That is not what you're going to get at a cocktail party today if you tell people you're a pollster or a survey researcher. That's just not what you're going to get. So the mentality has totally changed. There's a lack of trust that we've got to build. We got to get people more confidence that what we do, because what we do is really, really important. But we've got to sell that better.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're totally right. I don't think we've treated our respondents with, like, the care that we need to. And that's kind of gotten us to where we are today. And what you said about, like, a lack of coordination in the industry, we're all using the same panels. We're all asking the same, even within our own, organizations. when we send out those surveys, we're asking questions that we already know the answer to. Like there's so much passive data that we have access to now. Like if you're Delta, you don't need to ask like, when's the last time you flew Delta? Because guess what? You've got that data on people, and you probably don't even need to ask the questions about how is your experience. Like you probably know what a good experience looks like, and you've got the data to see if they had the experience that equals like. So all of that polling and the surveys that people are getting are so, repetitive and asking the same questions that we already, or like you said, spending 40 minutes getting all the data we could possibly get from them, where we could really focus our energy on the questions we don't have the answers to or couldn't possibly know from all the other data that we have. And, the other thing that had me thinking about was you were talking about the kind of loudest voices, like who's got the microphone. And now that's everybody's creating content, right? Everybody has a voice and has a microphone on social media. And I think that that's an area that we don't necessarily listen to as much or know how to put that into a usable format. But the same old kind of 40-minute surveys from the one of 2 or 3 panel companies is not necessarily cutting it anymore.
Yeah, and you triggered another thought too, is, in the old days, if you were doing like an opinion poll, that might, people didn't ask you what you thought about things all that often, right? So it was kind of exciting. You go back 50 years or something. It was pretty exciting if Gallup called you and asked you your opinion on the issues of the day. It's like, wow, cool, I get to represent, right? Or even if you were a user of a product and you got called, it was kind of exciting. But now there are so many different ways you can express your opinions on a product that a poll is not so special anymore. So I think that's happened too. And I think we got to be more selective. It's weird being in the industry saying we should do less research, but I'm seeing a lot of the research proposals that come my way. They're very, very tactical when they used to be way more strategic. We used to kind of do big strategic level studies and then, trust that the clients had people that were smart enough to make the tactical decisions. But now I think because we can do studies so fast and so quick, people are kind of scared to make any decision without consumer input, no matter how minor it is. So I do think I don't want to get too much into the DIY stuff, but I think that's causing some of it. Anyone can do a poll now. Sure. And that's certainly, I think everyone should agree, at least on the margin, that's causing a deterioration in the quality of surveys that are being out there, because we have, not that all DIY projects aren't good, but many of them are being authored by people that kind of don't know what they're doing. And that doesn't make that respondent want to respond to the good poll that comes next or the election poll. So, we're doing a lot. We're very uncoordinated as an industry.
Yeah. And I think that the speed that you just mentioned and, really needing research to make those smaller tactical decisions, it's the speed, but I think there's also a level of fear. Like we are living in very uncertain times. And, in some ways it's like the time for market researchers to shine because there's so many more questions coming internally. Like, you're the link to the consumer for a lot of these companies. So it's great that research is so sought after during these uncertain times, whether that be economic or political or pandemic or whatever. But it does get you to there's sort of a perfect storm of we can get the answer quickly. We're not sure how quickly people's opinions are changing due to all these other outside influences. So let's ask every small question, and maybe there is an opportunity to slow down, to speed up, and kind of ask those broader questions, spend the time with consumers to actually understand their opinions and what's going on in their lives versus do you prefer blue or red on this package, and make the decisions based on that, that kind of broader understanding as opposed to asking those really specific tactical questions, like you said.
Yeah. I feel like clients, it's funny. It's we have a real problem here, and it's pretty easy to beat ourselves up as suppliers. But I think we can point the fingers at the clients a little bit too. So if you're a client, listen up. I want to tell you. This is the only thing I really have notes for because I wanted to make sure I said this on this. Is Here's what you should do every time as a client. And I can tell you in my history, I have never had a client ask me this, and they should every time, right? In an RFP, here's what you need to ask your supplier every single time. You need to have them tell you what is the sample source and how are they getting people to respond to your survey? Who are these people you're surveying, right? And second, you got to ask them what they expect the response rate to be. And if they say something over about 10%, don't believe them. And third, this is the most important question you need to be asking your supplier, is you need to recognize there will be a non-response bias in any study you do. What will your supplier be doing to identify what that is, and what are they going to do to deal with it, right? And nobody ever asked me that. I mean, I do it a lot in reports anyway. I try to say, look, this is where we got because I'll give you a quick example. These panels that we use are the panel companies, I don't want to name names, where everyone gets their samples, right? They can be very different. I recently had an RFP for it was a household gadget that cost about $1,000, right? And they wanted to do a survey of like a couple thousand people who use this category. And I instantly said, I'm going to have an incidence problem here. I'm going to have a hard time finding these people. Let me bid it out and see if a couple, I went to 3 sample companies. Let me see if they can kind of, do an incidence test to see if they can do it, right? Well, the first one came, again, this is a consumer product gadget, costs like $1,000. The first one came back and said that 44% of their panel owns these things. The second one came back and said it was 32%. And the third one came back and said it was 19, right? And then I worked with the client from their own sales data. And our best estimate was the actual incidence in America of ownership of this product was probably about 9 or 10%. So there's this huge high SES bias in these panels to begin with. And that's part of the problem they have with the polls. The poll I did for this book, I did ask political party affiliation. And if you don't weight it, you end up with probably between 15 and 20% too many Democrats in your sample.
Wow.
So these panels are not randomly, and even address-based panels are not random panels. So it makes you have to control quotas so tightly that you start putting your thumb on the scale of the findings you're going to find. But anyway, it's, there's definitely these issues with that again, I don't think we're dealing with very well. It's very hard. And those biases don't matter on every study. So it is a study by study. That's why I said, if you're a client, you got to ask this, because those answers vary on a study by study basis, depending on what you're predicting. So, it depends on what you're measuring, whether those biases are going to matter.
Yeah. I mean, you just said it, like it's the propensity to like join a panel to begin with. Like you're already biased. Then the people who respond and don't respond, there's, and even just the way my first question when you're describing the incidents for all 3 of those panels for the same product is like, how did they ask that question? There's so many ways that you can ask that question in the wrong way and get the wrong.
Well, and this one was consistent because I gave them the question to ask, right? I said, hey, here, and implement this for, in this screener, and ask. It was identical. And, backing up to the polls, there's a famous experiment, by the way, if you want to know what goes wrong with the polls. It isn't all about the data you gather on the polls. Back up, I know we don't have too much time left. So the difference that the polls have is, in addition to figuring out something like who are you going to vote for, right? That's what we got to do the equivalent of that in every survey research project we do. We got to find an answer to a question. They also got to figure out, are you going to actually show up and vote, right? And so it's called a likely voter model. That's the additional hurdle they've got to get over, right? And the problem is that to me, this is the absolute irony of the whole thing. People will say polling is both an art and a science, right? I don't agree with that. I think it should be all science. It shouldn't be an art at all. But it becomes an art the moment we get done with it and hand the study off to the most scientific people in the organization, the methodologists. That's when it becomes an art. And to prove that, or to illustrate that, a gentleman named Nate Cohn, who works at the New York Times, did a poll in 2016 in Florida. Same poll, same data. Grabbed the raw data, gave it to 4 different pollsters, and had them give back to them what the election projection would be. And he got 4 different answers that were like 5 points apart. Exact same inputs, handing off to 4 different sets of scientists who came up with 4 different answers. So it's not scientific what we're doing. Clearly, there's subjective decisions being made along the way.
So interesting. This will be my last question for you is, are you going to write a blog post for the 2024 election, or have you learned your lesson?
I know. I think it's one of the burdens of this book is like, now I got to pay attention to the 2024 election. Now I probably will. It's a few years off at this point. Again, I think the pollsters, this book doesn't bash the pollsters, but it does criticize them for not focusing on the right things to improve. Again, they continue to focus on making their models more and more complex and not understandable, and not going after the core issue, which is the response rate bias, and getting more people to answer them. So, what do the short answer is, do I think, would I put my money on them getting it right in 2024? The answer will be, to the extent that I feel 2024 looks like 2020. We might end up with the same candidates. We might end up with similar issues. It could, but it's not a good bet in the long term. And again, we've got to fix this response rate issue. We're at 2 to 4%. We're going in the wrong direction. I mean, it's going to be 0 at some point. And, like it or not, the polls are still our best way of measuring public opinion. And they will, there's really no alternative in the short term, at least, that I can think of. It's still, we can think of behavioral data all we want in terms of insights. But a lot of times an opinion poll is a lot more informative to a marketer. Knowing what you did is great, but knowing what you think you did can influence your future behavior even more. And you need a poll or a survey to do that. So I don't think we're going out of business anytime soon, but we're going to be struggling with these quality problems for a long time.
Yeah, well, hopefully we can get ourselves to fix these issues in the next 2 years before the next poll. We'll see. Well, thank you so much. This has been great. Everybody go out and get John's book. It sounds super interesting. And yeah, hopefully we'll have a better poll the next time around.
Great. Thanks, Jen.
Thanks, everybody, for listening in. We will be talking later this week with Lonnie Main of Vox Pop Me and Red Shoes Living to talk about empathetic leadership. We will see you then.